Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we were going to be looking at a concept that is very interesting, but also, I think, pretty tricky.
Mhm.
And that's the idea of ego and the impact it has on achieving success.
Yeah.
So the book we're going to be using as our guide today is Ego is the Enemy.
Okay.
And one of the things that I found so interesting about this book is that it really examines how ego can actually get in the way of what we're trying to do,
Mm.
even when we think that it's our ego that's pushing us forward.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a funny thing, right? Because we are told to be ambitious. We're told to believe in ourselves.
Right.
But this book is arguing that there are times when that very belief can be a little bit inflated.
Yeah,
And it's actually the thing that's holding us back.
that's exactly right. And so I think, it's important to kind of define what we're talking about here when we say ego,
Mm.
because we're not just talking about confidence. Like, there's a healthy level of, believing in yourself and your abilities.
Mm.
But what we're really talking about here is that kind of overblown sense of self-importance
Mhm.
that can make us, blind to our own weaknesses, and can also make us resistant to feedback,
Mm.
which is something that the book talks a lot about. So to kind of illustrate this point, the book starts us off way back in ancient Greece with the philosopher named Isocrates. Have you heard of Isocrates?
I have heard of him, yes.
Yeah, so,
A long time ago.
yeah, he was giving advice
Yeah, way back.
to this young, ambitious man named Demonicus.
Right.
And so he's basically giving him advice on how to be successful.
Right.
And what I find so interesting is that even though, this was written, centuries and centuries ago,
Mm.
it's still so incredibly relevant today.
Yeah.
I mean, the advice that he's giving about the importance of things like modesty and self-control and good judgment,
Yeah.
these are things that we don't really hear a lot about these days,
No, it's almost the opposite these days.
Yeah. It's almost like the opposite,
It's like self-esteem at all costs.
Right, exactly. And it's like, believe in yourself, even if you haven't really done anything to deserve that belief yet.
Yeah, and I think Isocrates understood that, real success isn't built on this kind of, puffed up sense of self.
Right.
It's really built on character.
Yeah.
It's built on this willingness to learn and to grow and all of that.
And speaking of learning and growing,
Yeah.
the book then fast forwards a bunch of centuries to Shakespeare.
Okay.
And it highlights how he kind of echoes this same idea. We've all heard that famous line from Hamlet, "This above all, to thine own self be true."
Right.
Right? But even that piece of advice,
Yeah.
which sounds so wise on the surface,
Right.
can actually have a downside.
Oh, absolutely. Because if we're not careful being true to ourselves, it can sort of turn into blind faith in our own abilities,
Yeah.
even if those abilities maybe aren't fully developed yet.
Right.
Or if our perception of ourselves is a little out of whack with reality.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Shakespeare was very, very aware of that potential pitfall.
Yeah.
So we've got this ancient philosopher, and we've got this, literary giant,
Mhm.
both cautioning us against letting our ego run wild.
Right.
But how does that actually play out in a real-world scenario?
Yeah.
Well, the book dives into this really compelling case study, the story of General William Tecumseh Sherman during the Civil War.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
what's fascinating about Sherman is that here's this guy who, achieved ultimately a very high level of success. But he didn't start out as this fearless, ego-driven leader.
Yeah.
In fact, early in his career, he actually hesitated to accept promotions,
Oh, wow.
which I think is really interesting. He didn't want to just chase titles or power. He wanted to make sure that he was truly ready for the responsibility that came
Yeah.
with, a higher rank.
So he wanted to earn it.
Yeah.
He wasn't just in it for the ego boost of the
Thank you.
title.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that even later on, when he was already a seasoned general, he actually experienced a breakdown under the immense pressure of the war.
Yeah.
And I think this really illustrates that even the people who, reach what we might consider the pinnacle of success,
Right.
they were not immune to self-doubt
Yeah.
or the need to kind of manage their own ego.
For sure.
And it kind of makes them seem more human, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Because, we tend to put these historical figures up on a pedestal.
Right.
But it's a good reminder that they faced very real struggles and vulnerabilities, just like all of us do.
Yeah, we tend to forget that they're just human beings,
Yeah, exactly.
like everybody else.
So perhaps one of the most striking examples of Sherman's ability to keep his ego in check
Mm-hmm.
is his decision to actually support General Grant.
Yeah.
And he even waived his own rank to do so.
Wow.
Talk about putting the mission above your own personal ambition, right?
No. That's a
That wasn't about his ego.
it's a big one for sure.
It was about recognizing that Grant had certain strengths
Yeah.
and putting the needs of the Army first.
And what's interesting is that's kind of the opposite of what we see a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Like, people will be like, no, I should be the one in charge.
Totally.
Yeah.
I deserve that.
It's like, yeah, maybe Sherman could have, competed with Grant or tried to undermine him or something, but he didn't.
He took a much different approach.
Right.
Yeah.
And ultimately a more successful one.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And it makes you think about, your own career and
Totally.
are you letting ego drive your decisions?
That's such a good point.
Or are you making choices that are really aligned with your goals and values and
It's a good question to think about.
all of that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, as we continue our deep dive into ego is the enemy,
Yeah?
I mean, we've really just kind of scratched the surface here. And there's so much more to uncover about how ego can impact not just our careers, but our relationships, our personal development,
Yeah.
all of that.
It impacts all aspects of our lives. Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is so interesting is that the book also provides some really concrete strategies
Okay.
for actually managing our ego.
Oh, good.
For how to kind of harness that ambition without letting it sabotage our success.
That sounds useful.
Totally. So it's not just a warning.
Right.
It's also like a guidebook,
Yeah, that's what we need.
which I'm excited to dive into.
Right.
So we've kind of set the stage.
Yeah.
We've seen how ego can manifest in different ways.
Right.
And now I think we're ready to really get into the practical side of things.
Okay.
How do we actually keep our ego in check?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that it's working for us and not against us?
Right.
That's what we're going to be talking about in part 2. So stay tuned.
Okay, great. I'm excited.
We'll be right back.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. So welcome back. I am excited to really dive into some of the practical strategies for managing ego that Ego is the Enemy lays out. It's one thing to kind of recognize the dangers of ego, but it's a whole other thing to actually keep it in check in our daily lives.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's really easy to sort of fall into the trap of intellectualizing this concept, but not actually changing our behavior.
Yeah.
So I think it's really helpful to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what can we actually do
Right.
to manage our ego?
Okay. So one of the first things the book emphasizes is the importance of detachment. So the idea that we need to be able to kind of step back from our work and evaluate it objectively
Yeah.
without getting too caught up in our own emotional investment in it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that is a really crucial skill to develop, especially in today's world
Right.
where, we're constantly being told to build our brand and tie our self-worth to our achievements and all that.
Right. It's like our work becomes an extension of ourselves.
Yeah,
And so any criticism of our work feels like a personal attack.
exactly.
Yeah. So the book actually uses this really helpful analogy of a craftsman, like a potter, for example. The potter obviously cares about their work. They're striving for excellence.
Mm,
But they also understand that that pot is not them.
right. Yeah.
They can kind of step back, assess its flaws, make improvements
Right.
without feeling like they're being personally attacked.
Or taking it personally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like we need to develop that same kind of healthy distance from our own creations
Yeah.
so that we can see them more clearly and not be afraid to, make changes or receive feedback.
And that allows us to be more open to learning from our mistakes and,
Right.
make adjustments without feeling like our whole identity is on the line.
So how do we actually cultivate that kind of detachment?
Yeah.
Are there any specific techniques that the book recommends?
Yeah. So one practice the book talks about is focusing on the process rather than the outcome.
Okay.
So it's really about finding joy in that journey of creation
Yeah.
rather than obsessing over the end result or the recognition that we might get.
That makes me think about that idea of flow state
Yeah.
that psychologists talk about.
Yeah.
That feeling of being so completely absorbed in an activity
Right.
that you kind of lose track of time and ego just fades away.
Totally. And that is exactly the state of mind that this book is encouraging us to cultivate.
Right.
Because when we are so present and engaged in that process,
Right.
ego doesn't really have space to take hold.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
So detachment is about kind of separating our sense of self from our work,
Great.
focusing on the process, finding joy in the journey.
Hmm.
What else does the book highlight as being crucial for managing ego?
Well, another key aspect is cultivating humility.
Okay.
It's really about recognizing that we don't have all the answers
Right.
and that we can always learn and grow
Yeah.
and that we need to be open to feedback,
Right.
even when it's critical,
Even when it's hard to hear.
especially when it's hard to hear.
Yeah. And this is where Sherman's story, I think, becomes so relevant.
Yeah.
Because, he wasn't afraid to ask for advice,
Right.
to learn from his mistakes, to surround himself with people who are more skilled in certain areas than he was.
Yeah, it's funny because we often think of humility as being kind of passive or weak.
Right.
But in Sherman's case, it seems like it was actually a source of strength.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because I think true humility is not about putting ourselves down. It's just about having an accurate assessment of our abilities
Right.
and being willing to acknowledge, where we have limitations.
Exactly.
Yeah, it allows us to be more receptive to learning,
Yeah.
to seek out mentors, to
Mm.
collaborate effectively with others.
Absolutely.
It's not just about recognizing what we're not good at,
Right.
but also being open to learning from other people who might have expertise in those areas.
Totally. So it's like knowing what you don't know
Yeah,
and finding people who can fill in those gaps.
exactly. And this kind of ties into another point that the book makes, which is about managing our intensity.
Okay.
And, it might sound kind of counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but the book actually argues that unchecked passion can actually hinder our progress
It's interesting.
if it's being driven by ego.
Yeah. Because I can see how if we get too emotionally invested in our ideas,
Yeah,
we might become really defensive when those ideas are challenged.
totally. Or we might lose sight of the bigger picture,
Exactly.
because we're so focused on just being right.
Right. And that's where this idea of self-awareness comes in.
Okay.
Because we need to be able to step back
Yeah,
and really assess our own emotional state.
right.
To notice when our passion is starting to be fueled by ego
Right.
rather than by a genuine desire to, create or contribute.
So we need to be aware of our own tendencies,
Yeah.
our own triggers,
Ah,
our own patterns, and be
totally.
able to kind of catch ourselves when we're starting to slip into that kind of ego-driven behavior.
Yeah, like have you ever had that experience where you're like, oh man, I'm totally letting my ego get the best of me right now?
Oh, all the time.
It's like that moment of self-awareness is so important.
And it's so hard.
It is. It takes practice.
But the book does offer some helpful strategies for cultivating that self-awareness.
Oh, good.
One of them is to cultivate a sense of gratitude.
Okay.
So it's about focusing on the privilege that we have to do the work that we do,
Right.
to, be in the position that we're in, rather than focusing on, the recognition that we think we deserve.
That's really good advice. And I think gratitude can be such a powerful antidote to entitlement,
Yeah,
which is often, at the root of that ego-driven behavior.
totally. And another practice that the book recommends is to remind ourselves that true fulfillment comes not from that external validation,
Right.
the awards, the praise,
Yeah.
but from the intrinsic rewards of doing work that is actually meaningful to us.
That's so true. And when we focus on that joy of the process,
Yeah.
our need for that external validation starts to diminish.
Yeah. So it's about finding that satisfaction in the work itself,
Yeah.
not just in the applause or the recognition that might come from it.
Ex-
Totally. And that ties into another really important aspect of managing ego, which is living in the present moment.
Okay.
When we're consumed by ego, our minds are often racing ahead,
Yeah.
focused on what we want to achieve,
Right.
how we want to be perceived.
Yeah, like that future self that we're always striving for.
Right. But true peace and fulfillment actually comes from being present
Yes.
with the task at hand, with the
Right.
people around us,
Yeah.
the experience of life as it's unfolding.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in, the past or the future.
Yeah.
But the only moment we truly have control over is this one.
Right now.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we can cultivate that kind of presence, that kind of mindfulness,
Right.
ego has less space to take hold.
It loses its grip a little bit.
Yeah, totally. So we've talked about detachment, humility, managing intensity, gratitude, mindfulness. Are there any other key strategies that the book highlights for managing ego?
Yeah, and this one might seem counterintuitive,
Yep.
but the book actually emphasizes the importance of embracing failure. Ooh, that's a tough one.
I know, right? Because ego makes us so afraid to fail,
Yeah.
like to look foolish,
Right.
to be seen as anything less than perfect.
Yeah.
But this book is arguing that real growth comes from embracing our imperfections, learning from our mistakes
All right.
and using those setbacks as fuel for improvement.
That is so much easier said than done, though.
It is.
Especially in our culture that, really glorifies success
Right.
and kind of looks down on failure.
Totally. But I think we need to reframe our relationship with failure.
Yeah.
Because it's not the opposite of success.
Right.
It's a necessary part of the learning process.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, we learn more from our failures than from our successes.
Exactly. And when we can really embrace that mindset,
Right.
see failure as an opportunity for growth rather than a threat to our ego,
Yeah.
we actually become more courageous, more creative, and ultimately more likely to achieve that lasting success.
This is giving me so much to think about in terms of like my own approach to work and to life.
I can definitely see how fear of failure has held me back in the past.
And I think that's the beauty of this book, right? It's not just about these abstract concepts. It's about giving us tools and insights that we can actually apply to our own lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
Uh-huh.
but it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah. There's always more to explore.
Oh,
But I
gee.
think we've laid a really good foundation
Yeah.
for understanding how ego can kind of sneak into our lives
Right.
and what we can do to kind of keep it in check.
Totally.
And I think in part 3, we're going to connect these ideas even more directly to the challenges and opportunities of like living in the modern world.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
All right, so see you soon for the final part of our deep dive. All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Ego is the Enemy. As I've been talking about these ideas, I'm really struck by how relevant they feel. Even though we're, discussing historical figures and ancient philosophies and things like that.
I think it just goes to show that like human nature is human nature.
Right.
These challenges of like managing our ego and balancing ambition with humility, it's something that people have struggled with forever.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so I think as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to explore how these concepts actually play out in our modern world.
Okay, yeah.
For example, we talked about Sherman's approach to his career.
Yeah.
And how he, didn't shy away from those supporting roles early on.
Right.
And that almost seems countercultural today.
Yeah, it is kind of the opposite of what we're told to do.
Totally right.
Yeah.
Like everyone's telling us to hustle and, climb the ladder as quickly as possible.
Right. Build your personal brand.
Exactly.
All of it.
But Sherman's story is kind of reminding us that true mastery often takes time
Yeah.
and patience and a willingness to actually learn from other people who have more experience.
Yeah. It's about playing the long game, focusing on developing those skills and that knowledge, even if it means, taking a less glamorous path or delaying gratification a little bit.
Yeah, and it requires us to really be self-aware.
Yeah.
To be able to honestly assess our strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
And make choices that are truly aligned with our long-term goals.
Right.
Even if they don't offer like immediate rewards or recognition.
Right. It's not about the instant gratification.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we actually navigate that tension
Yeah.
between this pressure to achieve quickly and this need to develop our skills in this more, deliberate way?
It's a tough one. It's a balancing act for sure.
Totally.
And I think a big part of it comes back to managing our ego.
Okay.
It's about recognizing when our desire for success is really being driven by this need for external validation
Right.
rather than a genuine passion for the work itself.
It's like asking ourselves, why do I want this?
Yeah.
Is it because I truly care about this field? Or is it because I want the status, the recognition, all those external markers of success?
Right. Exactly. Those external things.
Yeah. And that kind of ties into another really important point that the book makes,
Yep.
which is the importance of staying connected to reality.
Yeah. Because it's so easy to get caught up in our own heads,
Totally.
in our own ambitions and desires,
Right.
that we lose sight of what's actually happening around us.
Yeah, we start to believe our own hype.
Right.
And that's where ego can really lead us astray.
Yeah. We develop this distorted view of our own abilities
Right.
and of the world itself.
Yeah, we might overestimate our skills,
Right.
underestimate the challenges that we're facing,
Yeah.
make decisions based on, wishful thinking rather than a clear-eyed assessment of this situation.
Right. Kind of living in a fantasy land a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah.
So how do we stay grounded?
Yeah. That's
How do we make sure that we're not letting our ego, create this kind of fantasy world that's disconnected from reality?
Well, one of the things the book suggests is seeking feedback
Okay.
from trusted sources.
Right.
So, being willing to ask for honest opinions
Yeah.
from people who are not afraid to tell us the truth, even if it's not what we want to hear.
Yeah, it's about having those people in our lives who can offer constructive criticism,
Yeah.
who can help us see our blind spots
Yeah.
and who can really challenge us to grow, even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's having those people who are going to be honest with you, even if it hurts a little bit.
And then it's also being receptive to that feedback,
Yes.
right? Because it's so easy to just dismiss criticism.
Oh, yeah, especially if it's challenging our ego.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But if we can really learn to listen with an open mind
Yeah,
and a willingness to learn it can be so incredibly valuable.
absolutely.
And it's about remembering that none of us are perfect.
Yeah,
We all have areas where we can improve.
for sure.
And feedback, even when it's hard to hear, is an opportunity for growth.
It's a gift.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's not just about seeking feedback from other people.
Right.
It's also about developing our own capacity for self-reflection,
Yeah.
to honestly assess our strengths and weaknesses.
To kind of take a step back and look at ourselves objectively.
Right, and ask ourselves those tough questions.
Yeah.
And be willing to confront the answers, even when they're not flattering.
Even when they're hard to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of self-reflection requires a certain level of detachment,
Yeah.
which we talked about earlier.
Right.
It's about being able to observe our thoughts and emotions without getting totally swept away by them.
Right. To not get so caught up in them.
Right, to kind of see ourselves with a little bit more objectivity.
Yeah, like you're watching yourself from the outside.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like we're developing this inner observer
Yes.
who can kind of watch our ego at play and help us make more conscious choices.
Exactly. And that inner observer can be so helpful for recognizing when our ego is kind of driving the bus.
Right.
When we're prioritizing self-promotion over genuine growth.
Or when we're letting that fear of failure hold us back.
Totally. It's about learning to recognize the subtle ways that ego can actually sabotage our success, even when we think we're acting in our own best interests.
Yeah, it's sneaky like that.
It really is.
It can really sneak up on you.
Yeah. And so this is where I think that concept of mindfulness becomes so important.
Yeah.
Mindfulness is about cultivating that state of present moment awareness,
Right.
paying attention to our thoughts and feelings and sensations
Yeah.
without judgment.
Just observing them.
Yeah, it's about creating space between ourselves and our thoughts and emotions.
Right.
So that we're not totally ruled by them.
To become the observer rather than the reactor.
Totally.
Right.
And when we can cultivate that kind of mindfulness, I think we're less likely to get swept away by those stories that our ego tells us.
Right.
The stories of inadequacy
Yeah.
and fear and the need to prove ourselves to other people.
It's about quieting those voices a little bit.
Totally. It's about developing that sense of inner peace and clarity.
Yeah. So that we can make decisions that are aligned with our values,
Right.
our goals, our
Not
true selves,
our egos.
rather than being driven by, the whims of our ego.
And that sense of inner peace can be so empowering.
Yeah.
It allows us to kind of navigate the challenges of life with greater resilience,
Yeah.
face setbacks with a little less fear, and pursue our goals with more clarity and focus.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into ego as the enemy, I'm left with a sense of, I think, hope and possibility.
Yeah.
It's challenging work,
Yeah.
this business of managing our ego.
It is.
But the rewards seem totally worth the effort.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
It's not a destination.
Right.
And it's a journey that requires this ongoing awareness and self-reflection and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions and patterns of behavior.
But ultimately, it's a journey that leads us closer to our true selves,
Yeah.
to a life of, greater meaning and purpose and fulfillment.
Absolutely. And I think to a world where, collaboration and compassion and the pursuit of excellence.
Rather than ego-driven competition,
Yeah.
can really flourish.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found these insights valuable, and we hope they inspire you to continue exploring this fascinating and often very paradoxical nature of ego
Yeah.
and its impact on our lives.
It's a journey, for sure.
All right, so until next time, keep diving.